All right, let's get going. So, once again, I'm Tim Meehan, chair of the Technical Steering Committee and Software Engineer at Meta. So I'm here to talk about Presto and some updates from the Technical Steering Committee. And I just wanted to say thanks everyone for joining. I see, really great turnout. Really happy to see all the faces here, especially early in the morning in California time. So welcome everyone who's here. All right, so let's get going. I think before we begin, it makes sense to kind of like say, what is Presto? Let's go over the basics. We're here at PrestoCon. Let's just sort of like talk about what is Presto, why we like Presto. So Presto is an open source SQL query engine for fast and reliable data analytics and the open data lakehouse. And so like we'll be talking about kind of like, this whole aspect of, one language, to do most of your needs, one interface across, many different silos and, the reliability and efficiency kind of like all through, the talks today. But then, I think like before, we get into a lot more detail, let's, I think, talk about what I think is a very important aspect of Presto, which is its openness. And so, like Presto is open source software. Everyone knows this, I think. Open source is a very, kind of like integral part of Presto. It's very important. So what this means is that, number one is there's a permissive license. So you're free to use the software, kind of like, how you'd like. It's open sourced with the Apache v2 license. But it's not just sort of like the, license to use the code. It's also, the way that the development around the code is governed. So there's an open foundation. It's the Presto Foundation that, guides the project. There's the governing board. Companies and individuals are free to join that. And then there's the Technical Steering Committee, which is, the technical governance for the project. And so like this openness in terms of, sort of like the project's direction is also, super important. It's important to know that, sort of like if you have something to bring to the table that you can, and there's processes and ways to move that forward. But then in terms of openness, it's not just, sort of like the ability to modify the code and the foundation, but also sort of, like the easiness ease of use to kind of like download and then, get going using it. You can download it from the Maven repo. There's Docker images so that you can get it up quickly. We have a new Kubernetes operator to kind of get running with that. So there's lots of options to get going using Presto. And then also, the technical community and the, developer community, who help each other with like, technical changes and, sort of like questions about how to use it. All of this, like the community itself, like the people who use it and make changes to it is also extremely important to Presto. But not just sort of, like the way that the code is, made available and that the way the project is moved forward, but then also like the way that you use Presto is open. So, it's open to use against any data source. It's very easy to use it against, either open or proprietary data sources through the connector API. So you can connect it to anything. And then, like within data sources, there's an openness in terms of, what file format you're able to use and what table format. So, like you could, use Hive, Hoodie, Iceberg, or whatever, like wherever you happen to kind of like put your data in, if it's in a, a different, database system. So there's this agnosticism in terms of like how the data is formatted and then, how the tables are laid out and, which system you're using for that. That I think is also kind of like a key ingredient to, like the Presto software. So in addition to, like the, like openness in terms of like, like where the data lives and, like how the data is structured, there's, the openness in terms of how you can use Presto. So there's like a wide variety of ways to use Presto. Interactive obviously was like what Presto was originally developed for. But there's a much more wider variety. You can use it for business intelligence tools. You can plug it into dashboards, and they'll run very quickly. And you can even use it for batch ETL. And so we'll be talking about some of the details, especially how we use it at Meta, about how we scale for batch and, like all the considerations that we've used. But and I'll talk about this later, but this concept of using the same language and the same software really for both across these different use cases is extremely powerful and important to, like I think Presto's direction and Presto's mission. And then, like even in terms of like, like the things that I mentioned, I think are kind of like obvious, use cases for a data tool, but it's also extremely versatile in that, like, like there's things that may be difficult to categorize. So, it could be, powering data for an application, using it for, computation intensive workloads that don't neatly fit into a warehousing role. Like all of these are, also acceptable uses for Presto. And so, it has this versatility where it's really sort of, like your, oftentimes it's your imagination, how you want to use Presto. And so this general purpose aspect of how you use Presto is also important to the project. So, we've talked about, various different ways of openness, but I think like another one is, like the one consistent single language, which is, like it, strives for ANSI SQL compliance. So this is, very much a familiar language in a data warehousing setting, and like very familiar for folks. And so like this move away from proprietary syntax and into like something that's very familiar for data warehousing needs is also very important. You don't have to tie yourself into different semantics, a different language. You have like pretty standard semantics and a language that will feel quite familiar. But then also, it's not just sort of like the ANSI SQL, but also like the amount of the full featuredness of it. So like the support for complex multi-stage queries, and sort of like allowing all the way from the very simple point queries to these complex analytical queries is also sort of like a critical part of Presto. And then maintaining this consistency across multiple different data sources is sort of like once again kind of like ties into the like openness over data formats, data layouts, and connector API. So just to quickly recap, open source, it's free to modify. There's a foundation that you can join to participate in a community to get help from. Like the versatility over many different data sources and this agnosticism to use it against even internal services that might exist within your company. That's also, I think, an important factor. And then like the ability to use it for use cases both standard and non-standard, I think is quite important. And then finally, you doing this all with like a single language that is consistent and familiar with everyone is sort of like I think key to Presto's sort of like openness in the form of not having to learn a new language. So I think taking a pause from that, we talked about what is Presto, and I think like the openness of the Presto Foundation's mission. Like, and I think like we'll talk about various aspects of kind of like these 3 points today. The first is, just to quickly touch upon it, is like what do we think about when we think about like data engineers and the challenges that they experience in their role. I think number one is having to use different engines for different types of workloads means that like you're inevitably going to have to sort of like switch between one and the other after certain limitations, or like something different comes along. That brings cost and overhead and maintenance, which slows the data engineers down. And then I think like Girish touched upon using multiple different interfaces and languages for siloed systems. That's also another struggle and a challenge. Not everyone has a neatly composed data warehouse, that sort of like centrally contains everything that you need. And then also like just, the costs, the total cost of ownership for a warehouse can often sort of like, grow at a rate that's faster than Moore's law. But I would like to focus, or spend a little bit of time on using different engines for different workloads, because this one in particular I think is quite important. Especially I think like it's worth pointing out that in this era we live in an era of cheap storage. Right, so I don't think it's ever been cheaper to kind of like just put additional data onto the cloud, and so given that context, this opens the doors for I think a lot of other things that used to seem not possible before, and I think like kind of like a big thing that this implies is that you can treat data analysis as something that is sort of like kind of like what the company does. It's not just something that certain siloed teams do, or it's not something that's really reserved for the executive leadership. It's something where the software engineer is sort of like doing some data analysis to measure certain effects of their feature or their code change or something, to measure sort of like the impact there, all the way up to senior leadership looking at sort of like keep KPIs and metrics. And so using this across the board to make data-driven decisions, I think is quite important in today's environment, and to do this in a way that's like a private like ensures privacy and security. So I think like in this environment, it's really important to have basically one tool that will power your dashboards, that can be used to analyze the data to make sure that like there's data integrity, and that like we're answering the right questions, and that like there's sort of like the SQL queries are sane and behaving as they ought to the same engine that's sort of like powering the interactive BI tool that can be used to drill down and to answer very specific questions at a higher level, all the way to the very lowest levels, so that we can power those insights. And that being the same tool that's used to prepare the data, to make sure that it's fast, and to make sure that like all these insights are quick, and like there's as little friction as possible. So like having as few tools as possible to kind of like do all these things is important, because there's less context switching, there's less different systems to support, there's like consistency in your workflow, consistency in the semantics, and just sort of like less cognitive overload for the data engineers and the company. And so like we'll talk about, I think like I'll have a note also with Arjun later today about how we deploy batch at Meta, but I think like in particular at my current employer, like this is particularly important, because like we use Presto for kind of like these things that I mentioned, the data exploration, answering questions of sort of like about data to make good decisions, optimizing it so that like it's efficient when it goes into some other data source. It could be another pipeline, or it could be a dashboard or a BI tool, and then sort of like tweaking iteratively, improving the queries, and then putting that into a recurring workload so that it runs sort of like consistently with a consistent landing time and predictability, and then finally sort of like at the end running a dashboard so that like we get these insights and we can share these insights with other people. So like what I think is really powerful is we use Presto for kind of like all these things. And so having this one consistent language that, and not having to swap back and forth, really reduces overhead and improves the quality of life for the people that use Presto. And so like really I think the simplification is kind of like a very critical part of like simplifying the management and the running of a data warehouse, and making it so that like it becomes just a a much more simple and obvious thing. Right. Okay. So I think we talked about what is Presto, and like all the aspects of Presto's sort of like openness, including the foundation, and like the code, and how you can use Presto, and like I think we talked about using a single language, single tool to do, all these different things, and, like having it work well across all these different use cases. I'd next like to, spend a minute to talk about, some of the highlights that from the TSC. So the first is, sort of like from the developer community, we've introduced the concept of code owners. So, like many connectors are added to the Presto community to add, connect to various different data sources. We now have code owners to, use against connectors, and to, use against, to also specify different parts where someone has a particular expertise. We've opened this up and provided code owners so that people, more people can be, brought into the fold and, help to contribute to Presto's ecosystem. And so I'd like to welcome Vinod and Todd Gao from the Hoodie community, who are now sort of like, committers through this code ownership. And then also Nikhil and Arun, also new committers since last time we met. We accepted the Presto Query Predictor project, which uses ML techniques to estimate the cost of a query. This helps as you sort of like scale out your Presto, clusters, and helps to, provide load balancing and evenness of load. We added the Ranger plugin, to the Presto code base, and we also added the Presto router. Both the query predictor and the router came from Chunsu from Twitter. The Presto router is, sort of like a load balancer that sits in front of multiple different Presto clusters, and there's been, a few talks about this from the community. We now have something that's open source that you can feel free to modify and use if those needs suit you. We have a new TSC process where we have elections, and we've revamped, the process to become a TSC member and to participate in the TSC. We held our first election last year and welcomed a new class of TSC members who are now participating and helping to govern the TSC. So I would like to welcome everyone who is coming into the new TSC. And we've made some very important updates to the conformance program. And hope to have a much more detailed update in the coming months. And so next, let's talk about, sort of like, I think like what's coming up that's got me excited. Like the first one is, like we've talked about this in the past, there's, Velox integration. I think, as we, move on, especially with Presto on Spark, there's going to be some very important updates about Velox as it integrates with Presto on Spark, and then also improving the integration with Presto Streaming and Classic. There's lots of, sort of like very promising initial results that, I think like are going to be pretty exciting to see once, down the road. There's also Presto on Spark, like we talked about this last PrestoCon, and as we'll mention at today's, sort of like a talk on Meta, it's become a very critical part of our infrastructure and a key part of, like this strategy of using one single consistent language across, multiple different systems and not having to switch between two different systems. I think, like another one that's really got me excited is history-based optimization. We talked about this at the TSC meeting a couple months ago, but the ability to use historical estimates to improve, like the optimization of queries and to provide functionality that couldn't have been provided before is very exciting. So definitely, like looking forward to see, some of these updates and some of the wins that we, expect to see from that. Interactive fault tolerance is, something that we're exploring, and, something that I think, will be really exciting, especially for, interactive customers, who wish to, sort of like improve the reliability of their queries and run over, like less predictable hardware. And then, like there's a whole host of optimizer improvements that, we're starting to focus on and starting to really, sort of like double down on, investing and improving the Presto optimizer. So lots of things I think coming along there that should, like make queries faster and improve the experience for Presto for everyone, both for, Presto and on Presto on Spark. So, like, I think we've talked about, a lot of different things. I kind of like, as we're approaching the end, I just want to kind of like close on a few different things. one of the reasons that, kind of like we use Presto is that we know that it works. We know that it works at, this pretty enormous scale. And so, I think that gives you, kind of like this assurance that there's not a whole lot that you can throw at it where, it just, flat out won't work. And so like, not only, does it have this track record, but we've put out a lot of investments, to sort of like, helping it to scale even further. Some of these include disaggregated coordinators that we talked about at last PrestoCon, Presto Unlimited and Presto on Spark that's helped to scale on batch. And then like, sort of like looking forward to today, you'll hear about, Meta's experimentation platform, which will go into, some of the ways that this is scaled for that. And then also like we'll touch upon this on some of the talks on the Lakehouse. There's a couple of sessions around that today as well. The second is like kind of tied to the first, but like we know that like at enormous scale, we run reliably. So kind of like along that same note, like we know that, as we scale up, there's not a whole lot that you can throw at it that will make it, very unreliable. We've also, improved this through disaggregated coordinators, Presto on Spark for batch, and also just sort of like like lots of sort of, not headline features, but just lots of work to, keep making Presto reliable and sort of like, paying attention to the details. There's a lot of work that goes into that that makes Presto a terrific, stable platform. Presto is fast, it's, obviously, it's kind of like one of its hallmarks, and we'll talk about speed today, like with Uber's talk on real-time analytics and the replicated reads talk by George from Meehan. And then like in the past, we've contributed quite a bit, to, really taking this to the next level, as we've talked about in the past with, multi-tiered caching with RaptorX and just, along disaggregated storage, advanced filter pushdowns with ARIA scan, and optimized repartitioning. So there's, lots of track record for, Presto as a fast and efficient system as well. So I think, like closing, I've said a lot of things that Presto offers, but I think, part of, like Presto is like the community. And so, it's, sort of like a two-way door. The more you participate, the stronger Presto becomes. And so it's not just sort of like, what we can get from Presto, but like there's this, community of people who, can help each other out and, can provide features for that other people might find useful. And so there's tons of ways to participate. The first is, like there's Slack, prestodb.slack.com. Ask a question there if you have a, idea for a development, like there's the dev channel, lots of different places to participate. If you find, an issue, functionality that's missing or an idea that you have for Presto's future, file an issue on the, our GitHub issues page at prestodb/presto, that GitHub slug. You can take open issues and offer to work on them. Lots of, sort of like issues to take up, and we really love to see these contributions, back to the project. If you have like a particular use case that doesn't quite fit, kind of like the standard mold, those are super interesting. Even if they do fit the standard mold, like consider contributing a blog post. There's lots of I think like by contributing these blog posts, there's lots of things that we all learn from each other. And so, they're definitely, I think, extremely useful. And then finally, if you're coding oriented, contribute a connector or a bug fix or, something along those lines. There's lots of ways to contribute back to the core project. And as I said, it's an open community, an open code base. We love to see those technical contributions back to the project. All right, so I think that's it for me. Once again, I want to thank everyone here for for coming and looking forward to all the talks today. It's I think we have a really exciting lineup.